Today's episode is brought to you by Mazars. SoundCartel. After all we've been through, who would have thought that the insolvency rates would actually be down? But are the figures masking what could be a wave of insolvencies to come? From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. Indeed, rates of insolvency are down, according to Sean Wengel. Sean is Director of Restructuring and Insolvency at William Buck, and he's the kind of guy you'd probably want on your side if your business starts looking a little shaky. Early intervention and good advice is key, he'll advise, and he also lists the red flags that indicate if you're running into trouble. Problem is, that's what might happen as the government and others withdraw the support they've offered thus far through COVID. There have been all sorts of changes to the insolvency and safe harbour rules during the past year, which Sean will update us on shortly. First, for Heather Dawson, an update on those insolvency figures, which are contrary to what many of us might have guessed.
Insolvencies are at half their historic levels, and this has been the case since the number of companies entering external administration dramatically fell towards the start of last year in 2020. So it's been a strange phenomenon that we didn't exactly expect at the start of COVID.
So does that mean that government support, JobKeeper and so on, has done its job really to keep businesses afloat?
Yeah, look, anecdotally, it seems that some insolvencies might have been prevented by the government support, but it doesn't necessarily mean that underlying businesses are doing well. What we've seen, as well as the government relief measures, is creditors not taking as an aggressive approach as they normally would. Banks aren't appointing receivers like they might have in the past. The tax office isn't pursuing as many debts. In fact, government debt is growing during this time. So government support's been part of it, but not the only reason why insolvencies are down against historical levels. And I think as support is withdrawn by the government, we're going to see more businesses that have been artificially propped up by these support measures unable to trade, and they're going to need to either adapt or inevitably fail. One of the challenges with the support that businesses have received is they've been able to trade profitably, but really their underlying business is flawed and they're actually not profitable. So what happens there is they draw on their assets, and this leaves businesses with very little in the way of working capital, sometimes very little in the way of human resources to employ to instigate a turnaround or a restructure. And when restructuring advisors, such as myself, get involved, we can't work miracles. We can only do something with what we've got there to work with. And if there's nothing there to work with, then unfortunately often it means there's very little left to save, and failure can be more likely.
The government also introduced the temporary safe harbour laws for most businesses. Can you remind us about those temporary measures and how they were set up to help?
Yeah, so during COVID, the start of the COVID pandemic, the government introduced some emergency relief measures. And one of the main relief measures was the safe harbour from insolvent trading, which applied to all Australian companies. So between the 25th of March 2020 and 31 December 2020, directors were essentially relieved of their duty to prevent insolvent trading. So this meant that businesses could incur debts when they may not have been able to repay those debts, and the directors wouldn't be personally liable for those debts if the businesses ultimately entered into liquidation. It doesn't mean the debts didn't have to be repaid, and it didn't affect any commercial agreements between companies and their creditors, which were still enforceable during that time. It just meant directors weren't liable under the insolvent trading laws that they would traditionally have been liable under.
You said up to December, so do any safe harbour relief laws still apply?
Well, yes, they do. So safe harbour, the concept of safe harbour from insolvent trading was introduced before COVID, so back in 2017, those laws are still in effect. Now, they're not as far-reaching and not as accessible to every business in Australia like they were during the emergency relief measures. But yes, directors can still enjoy safe harbour from insolvent trading if they meet certain qualification criteria. And that qualification criteria largely around appointing a suitably qualified restructuring advisor to help you build a restructuring plan that will see you trade out of this difficult solvency position that you might find your business in, and meeting a few other terms that the Corporations Act sets out. So that is still a very valuable tool for directors of businesses that are struggling to allow them to trade through difficult times without that risk of personal liability for insolvent trading.
Okay, well, in addition, last December, I understand the government introduced what you've described as the most substantial insolvency law reforms in years. But even so, you say they could be better. So could you tell us about these laws and how useful they've been?
There were two main reforms released during the current pandemic by the Commonwealth Government. Those reforms were really announced with little to no consultation with the insolvency profession. So it took everyone a little bit by surprise in the insolvency profession and also in business to some extent. So these new insolvency laws, basically two main tools available to businesses. One is called a small business restructuring plan, and the second is a simplified liquidation process. So these two tools are available as a debt restructuring regime or a winding up tool for businesses with less than $1 million of debt, and certain other criteria being met as well, such as all tax reporting obligations up to date. And so these tools are meant to be a less costly insolvency process or a less costly external administration process for businesses that don't have significant debts. Because one of the criticisms of the current insolvency regime is the cost that it incurs in entering into these external administrations. So these laws look to reduce the administrative burden on liquidators and debt restructuring administrators to enable smaller companies to access these tools. But since these laws came into effect on 1 January 2021, there's been a minuscule take-up of them. So we're talking really only over a dozen or so companies in Australia in the first 5 to 6 months have actually used these arrangements, and that's much less than the government would have hoped.
So will the government reform them, do you think, ahead?
There is some talk that the government will increase the debt thresholds. So currently businesses with debts under $1 million can access these regimes, amongst other criteria, as I mentioned. So there's some talk of potentially increasing that to a higher amount, but there's no certainty around that. I guess there's also concerns that due to the lack of consultation before these laws were introduced, there's now an avenue for unscrupulous business advisors to have access to these regimes and to advise businesses on accessing these regimes. And that's a concern for businesses because they need to make sure that they're dealing with reputable advisors. So one of the other abilities for businesses to access these restructuring tools is they don't need to be administered by a typically qualified registered liquidator. They've introduced a new class of registered liquidator, which is somewhat easier to attain. And there's a risk that some unscrupulous advisors might get their registrations as small business liquidators. And we don't want to see that putting the businesses that they advise in difficult situations because they're not aware of all of the plethora of insolvency regime legislations out there.
Okay, well, meanwhile, here we are, COVID's still with us. And as broad business support is withdrawn, what do you think is going to happen to some businesses who have managed to survive thus far, Sean?
Some businesses will survive, and that's largely due to the relief that they've received from government and from creditors during COVID. Some businesses have already failed. They've shut their doors or liquidated. Some businesses, though, may have already begun failing and they're being artificially propped up by a lack of debt enforcement, a lack of action by their directors. And these are the businesses that can likely be saved with early intervention by their directors and with the assistance of suitably qualified external advisors.
Well, what do you see as the red flags, if you like, to insolvency, Sean?
Yeah, so there's some common red flags that pop up, and we've observed these over the years working in insolvency. Probably the first few are the most common that we'd see. The first few that I'd mention would be ageing debts, outstanding tax lodgements, and outstanding employee entitlements. And these are usually pretty big indicators that there's some challenges the business is facing over a period of time. Then the fourth red flag, I would say, would be swapping debt for debt, so borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. Poor record keeping. It's not uncommon to see lack of financial accounts being prepared or a lack of information flowing to the directors or between divisions within the business. Then the sixth red flag would be placing too much reliance on the next big job. And that can be an indicator of temporary insolvency issues and maybe not necessarily long-term insolvency issues. But I find that a lot with contract type businesses where they really just have to get through this period of time to get to the next big job. And then the last two red flags that I'd probably mention would be increasing receivables. So your clients struggling, so increasing debtor days, finding it more difficult to collect those debts. And then inactive assets. So vehicles, trucks, machinery sitting around not being used. It can be an indicator that potentially the business is overcapitalised, and you can often employ those assets elsewhere by liquidating them and using that cash for something else.
Okay, well, final question, Sean. What advice would you give to business operators who feel that they might be heading to the brink?
I would say two things. Surround yourself with the right advice. This can come from professional services and also people within your industry. Sometimes something as simple as a conversation with a competitor who has a different accountant can reveal something to you, like a grant you didn't know about or some pathway through a difficult time. And then the final point would be early advice and intervention is key to avoiding terminal insolvency.
That was Sean Wengel, Director of Restructuring and Insolvency at William Buck. This episode of Business Essentials Daily is produced by the team at SoundCartel. Thanks for listening. I'm Nicole Goodman. We'll bring you more Be Daily tomorrow. Follow at BE Daily Podcast across social media and head to bedaily.com.au for more from the Business Essentials Daily podcast. SoundCartel. This episode was brought to you by Mazars. To find out more, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.